All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started if you want to take your seats. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this final lecture in this breakthrough series this term. And we're saving the best for last. We have Sonia Seneviratne here from ETH Zurich. Before we get started, I just want to thank, as always, Howard Weider and the Canada Excellence Research Chair for underwriting the series, and thank all our simulcast and live viewers who have been following the series through the fall term. Sonia is here as of last night, so she's had a very busy day from Zurich. She's a professor at the Institute for Atmospheric and Climate Science at ETH Zurich, and has really had some quite stunning early career success. She finished her PhD about 10 years ago, I think 2003. Last year was awarded the McIlwain Award from the American Geophysical Union, the highest award for a young career scientist. This is all fields of the geophysical sciences, and was also made a fellow of the AGU. And this year she was made a highly recited researcher from ISI, Thomson Reuters. And when you look at her CV, I can count 6 or 7, I think, Nature papers in the last few years. Nature Geoscience, Nature Climate Change. Her impact on the field is really quite impressive. And for that, you know, she's been given these awards and recognition, but she's also been, I think, a real selfless giver of time, co-chairing the GWEC Scientific Steering Group, and is involved with Howard, of course, on that. Has been a lead author of IPC, an extreme, a report on extremes that I think ended in 2012. So it's really a delight to have Sonia with us, share her knowledge in terms of effects of land hydrology on atmospheric processes. So welcome, Sonia.
Yeah, thank you, Alps. It's working. Yeah. Thank you very much, Jeff, for this very kind introduction. I feel almost humbled now. I hope you won't be disappointed. And it was a great pleasure to be here. I had really very nice visit with many people. I think we had great talks, great discussion the whole day, and it was very stimulating. So I was very happy to be here. So I will talk about the effects of land hydrology on atmospheric processes and climate change. And yeah, I want first to acknowledge all of my co-authors, which are people from my research group at ETH Zurich. And we have seen today, and I think it's a main topic of research within your institute, which is basically what is the impact of atmosphere on hydrology, of climate on hydrology. So generally focusing on one direction of link between climate and the water cycle. And what I want to talk about today is actually a different relationship, which is asking the question, well, what is the possible impact of hydrology on climate, which has been less studied? So basically, most of my talk really will be on this topic. To which extent, when we have changes in water availability on land or changes, in water processes, does this affect climate or the atmosphere? One specific feedback loop I'm going to focus on is interactions between droughts and heat waves. That's actually quite interesting because in many cases those two extreme processes are connected. So if you have a heat waves, you have higher temperature. Generally, you have also less precipitation, but the temperature itself will lead to more evapotranspiration, so a stronger drying of the soil. At the same time, as I will show, when you have a strong drying of the soil, this affects the energy balance and will lead to less evapotranspiration and then stronger heating of the atmosphere. I have also this figure which is summarizing those links. I also want to show that it's not that easy. So basically, we have a number of relationships that are relating those different processes. So if you take drought, so you have a soil moisture decrease, this will actually lead to an evapotranspiration decrease. And so, as mentioned, lead to temperature increase because you have less moisture availability for evapotranspiration. So it means actually more sensible heat flux. And you have this positive feedback loop here, which is basically the sum of two negative feedback relationships. So it's a bit complex, and I'll go into more detail later on. In general, one figure also show often as an introduction is this one figure, which is rather for ocean scientists and atmospheric scientists. So in climate science, this topic is also quite new. So I would say for hydrology it's new because you tend to look at the impact of atmosphere on the land and not so much the other way around. And for atmospheric scientists, it's relatively new because there's been a lot of research on connections between the ocean and the atmosphere, but actually considering the impact of land on the atmosphere has not got a lot of attention. But of course, we are interested actually in climate and weather on land. I mean, that's why we are living. So maybe we don't really care if there is an extreme temperature event in the middle of the Pacific. What we're interested in is what is the temperature in Saskatoon, what is the temperature in Switzerland. And that's why land processes are so important, because they directly affect land climate, so where we are living. That's why it's actually really important to consider those processes. Just as an illustration, I'm showing some results from a recent commentary we published with colleagues in Australia, which was published in Nature Climate Change, where we were looking at the recent development of temperature extremes during the hiatus period. And I don't know if you have heard about it, but there was a lot of debate in the media discussing the possible climate pause in climate change. And I don't know how many of you have heard about it? Just to, yeah, okay, yes. Okay, so it was kind of taken up by skeptics saying, well, okay, there is no climate change and so on. So what this whole discussion was about was looking at the change in global mean temperature. And so, for instance, this black line here is a change in global mean temperature from an observational data set. And so you see that in those, basically since about 98, there is a bit of a flattening of the evolution of the global mean temperature. Global mean temperature meaning mean temperature over land and the ocean. Now, what we looked at was the change in temperature extreme on land, which again is what we would care most about. I mean, if we're interested in impacts, it's actually what we would like to look at. And you see that temperature extreme actually have continued to increase. So actually, this is also illustrating the fact that looking at global mean temperature is not really a good measure for understanding what is happening on regional scale. And so in terms of changes in impacts, you see that there have been no changes. And the main explanation for this is that there's been a lot of heat uptake in the ocean, and so the surface of the ocean has not warmed as quickly, but actually have more heat uptake, which at some point this heat will also come back. And on the land, actually, you see that there was a stronger increase of temperature also over this time period. And in addition to this, we have also a further warming of temperature extremes, possibly due in part to increased drying in those regions. So I'll say a bit more about this. So in any case, this is a further illustration that we really need to understand the land feedback processes if you're interested in regional changes over land. So here is a cartoon I often use to illustrate the range of processes in which land basically affects the climate system. First, there are direct impacts on the water cycle. So if you consider the whole precipitation falling on land, 60% of all this moisture is evaporated back to the atmosphere. So it's basically a huge amount of water which is just returned back to the atmosphere, which means also that evaporation itself is an important source of moisture for precipitation. In addition, there are substantial effects in the energy cycle. So the evaporative cooling, which I already mentioned quickly. So basically what we are looking at is this energy balance here. So the net radiation, the total radiation that is available at the surface, is split between latent heat flux, which is connected to evaporation. So that's energy that is required for evaporating moisture from the land. And then sensible heat flux, that's the total heat, which is then used to heat the atmosphere. And so you see that if you have dry conditions, so this flux is decreased and you will have much more heating of the atmosphere. That's important for heat waves. And then I'll discuss this. It's a bit less related to hydrology, but actually a bit more than you would guess. So I'll discuss this at the very end. That's possible impact from surface albedo for the climate system. And so basically, of course, this is affecting the shortwave radiation balance. And as I will show, basically, there are also some links actually to moisture availability from this feedback loop. And so in terms of total impact, you see that latent heat flux is use about 50 to 60% of all net radiation. So if this flux is, for instance, disappearing, then you would get doubling or more of sensible heat flux. And variations of albedo can be of the order of 0.1 to 0.2. Okay, so now I'll speak about some moisture temperature feedbacks as first topic, and then I'll discuss droughts, and especially one recent study we had about changes in global drought. and then I'll talk briefly about possible impact of land albedo on temperature extremes and drought. So in terms of the possible impact of soil moisture on temperature, I've already shown this to some students this morning, and I think several students have read the review paper, so you should be familiar with this figure. And it's based on the well-established Bodico framework, which we also discussed with students this morning. And so it's showing the evaporative fraction, so that's a fraction of net radiation, which is used for evaporation as a function of soil moisture content. And as you can see, this defines three broad regimes. So you have a wet regime here, where actually the total energy used for evapotranspiration doesn't depend on soil moisture. So if you have small variations in soil moisture, it won't affect evapotranspiration. Then you have a transitional climate regime here, where you have strong impacts of soil moisture on this on the evaporative fraction. And then if you have dry condition, you have again very little impact on the fluxes, because basically you have no moisture available. So in terms of feedbacks, generally you will see most impact in transitional regime, which means that in regions where you can get to drier conditions, or at least in some years. So you could imagine you have mostly a humid regime, but at least in some years it gets a bit drier. And I must say I don't have a lot of experience with the type of climate you have here, so I was trying to, a bit struggling with where I would put Saskatchewan, because in some ways it's quite a dry regime. I mean, there is only 300 millimeters of rain, from what I heard. So I would be interested in to which extent I'll basically climate in this region would relate to this diagram. So in terms of impact on temperature variability, if you have a dry climate regime, you will have mostly sensible heat flux. So again, a very strong heating from the land surface. And wet regime, a lot of latent heat flux. And then transitional regime, a strong variability of those two fluxes. So here I'm showing some results illustrating the importance of soil moisture for temperature and temperature extremes. This is a study from Randy Koster, whom I worked with a few years ago. And it's from the Global Land Atmosphere Coupling Experiment, GLACE, which was also a GWAX project. And as Jeff mentioned, I'm now co-chair, and Howard was also involved as vice chair within the project. So this is showing the impact of soil moisture for temperature using different types of initializations and for different time frames. So within 16 to 30 days, so basically 3 to 4 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks, and then 7 to 8 weeks. And it's looking at the forecast scale. So basically, if you have an increase in forecast scale from initialization of soil moisture. And you see that actually in North America, you can get quite a strong increase in, well, it's not a strong increase, but you get an increase in scale. And it gets even larger if you have a more extreme initialization. This was also analyzed further in Europe. And you should see that there are some increase in scale in this region. Now, actually, if you look at this study and the further results from the GLACE 2 study in more detail, you will see that there was not much scale in other regions, which was maybe a little bit disappointing for some people. But there was some reason also for this. It was mostly a focus on June, July, August, mostly a focus on mean temperature. And so the question is, what happens if you look really at always the hottest months in each location, and if you look at extreme temperatures. And for this, we used another approach where we tried to use observations. And what we did was to try and relate moisture availability with temperature extremes. And that's a study that was led by Martin Hirschi in our group, which was done for Southeastern Europe. And so we expected from analysis of evapotranspiration that this region would be one of those regions lying in the transitional climate regime. And what you see here is the percentage of hot days in summer as a function of antecedent precipitation availability. So that's the standardized precipitation index. That's basically precipitation deficit the 6 months before the summer. And you see an interesting scatter plot here. So if you had wet conditions, basically you have a very little number of hot days. But if you have dry conditions, you see that you can have very high numbers of hot days. So basically those very extreme summers, where you have a very large number of hot days, HD stands for hot days, basically only occur after dry conditions. So this suggests actually an impact of moisture availability for temperature extremes. We also quantified this with quantile regression, computing regression for different quantiles. You see this increasing slope, which means that it's the highest occurrence of extremes which is more strongly affected. Then Brigitte Müller, who was also doing a PhD in our group, extended this study on global scale. And so she looked at the correlation between the number of hot days, NHD stands for number of hot days, in our interim, that's the reanalysis product, and preceding 3 months precipitation deficits. And so the idea was again to look at each location, in this case now for the hottest month at each location, whether we could find a connection with moisture deficit in the preceding 3 months. And actually we found, it was a bit surprising, but that this relationship is quite strong in many regions. So certainly in southeastern Europe, where we had expected it, and so in further regions in southern Europe, but also, for instance, in North America, and I would say actually this would even include Saskatchewan, so it would be relevant here. So yeah, definitely would be very interesting to investigate this here. And you see actually many regions of the southern hemisphere, which again were not identified in previous studies because there was always this focus on June, July, August. And so you see, for instance, Australia, Southern Africa, and also South America. So we find that many regions, basically, you have hot extreme following dry conditions. We try to make a link to forecasting to see to which extent having some information about precipitation deficit would lead to some forecasting probability of hot extremes. And so those maps are looking at the probability of having an above average number of hot days in each location after either dry or wet condition. So dry on the left and wet condition on the right. And so SPI, this is some given threshold, but this basically means dry conditions or wet conditions. And you see that if you had dry condition beforehand in all those hotspots that were identified, basically you tend to have a quite high number of hot days. So the probability is of the order of 60 to 80%. And after wet conditions, the probability is much lower. It's only of the order of 20 to 40%. And again, this actually also includes Saskatchewan, at least for the dry extremes. Yeah. Then we did another study for Europe where we were looking at the combined rules of soil moisture and circulation patterns for the occurrence of hot extremes. And if I go back to this figure, an interesting point is you see that you need to have dry condition to have hot extremes, but it's not a sufficient condition. So it's a necessary condition to have hot extremes, but it's not a sufficient condition. As you can see, after dry condition, you can still have some summers where you have actually very little number of hot extremes. And so this study, which was done in collaboration with colleagues in France, we looked at the combined role of circulation patterns and dry springs. And we find that there was a high percentage of hot days found for a combination of dry springs and then anticyclonic summer weather regimes. And this is illustrated here. This is the frequency of anticyclonic weather regimes in Europe. So is there blocking or Atlantic low circulation patterns? And you see here the percentage of hot days in continental Europe. And again, you have quite a messy scatter plot. But generally, you have a bit higher frequency of hot days when you have a higher frequency of anticyclonic weather patterns. But this relationship is much stronger if you had a dry spring. So basically, all those symbols which are in red are for the 20 driest late winter to spring periods. And these are the wettest in blue, the wettest late winter to spring period. And you see clearly that after basically drier condition, you have a stronger relationship between the percentage of hot days and the frequency of anticyclonic weather regimes. So we found that basically both aspects are very relevant, as you can see here. So if you want to have many hot days, then you need basically both dry winter springs and anticyclonic summer weather regimes. So improved soil moisturization and modeling together with improved prediction of summer weather regimes can help forecasting extreme hot days. And so both are necessary but not sufficient conditions. Here I'm showing some more recent results when we try also to use remote sensing products. Actually, one student asked this morning, yeah, what type of data would you like to use for this analysis? And an important new source of data is that we have a lot of remote sensing products. So we tried to look at one product which is measuring soil moisture from microwave remote sensing. And then we looked again at correlation between the soil moisture from this product and then the number of hot days. And actually you find similar patterns. That's the result when using the remote sensing product. And that's the result using the standardized precipitation index. As you can see, we find similar hotspots, but they show a little bit weaker signal. And what we found was the reason for this different behavior. So as mentioned, qualitatively it's similar, but the strength of coupling is a bit weaker. And we found that this was probably related to the fact that the remote sensing product is mostly measuring soil moisture in the topsoil. So it's measuring soil moisture in the top 2 centimeters, more or less, while what is relevant for evapotranspiration is moisture in the root zone. And so what we did was to compare, this is a study led by Martin Ishii, was to look at the variability in the top soil moisture and the root zone soil moisture as the number of locations where soil moisture is measured, point scale soil moisture. And so this is the variability in the surface soil moisture and the root zone soil moisture for the driest conditions and then all conditions. And it's interesting, so you see, if you have very dry conditions, in general, so if you take all conditions, you have more variability at the surface than over the whole root zone. But if you only focus on the driest condition, actually you have less variability at the surface. And the reason for this is that you have, the storage is much smaller, so it dries out more quickly. So basically, when you have dry conditions, it's already dry anyway. So basically, between all possible dry conditions, you always have just an empty storage. And you have much more variability if you look at the total root zone. So it's just illustrating that it's really important to look at total root zone soil moisture variability in terms of impact of droughts, and not only as surface soil moisture. I'm showing here some more recent results where we tried to further look at this relationship between moisture availability and temperature extremes. In this case, using an extreme value theory model. So it's actually some results from the WCRP and GWEX-funded summer school. And what we found there was, if you look at the extremes, so the highest temperature in given summer months, and a soil moisture product, which was partly derived from with a model, we find a mostly linear relationship in this case. So if we look at absolute impact on temperature and not the number of hot days. So you see here, the impact on the number of hot days is a nonlinear effect, and in terms of the absolute temperature, you find mostly a linear effect. But this basically confirms again that moisture availability is quite important for temperature. And you see also that shifting moisture conditions between dry and wet conditions leads to a difference in temperature of the order of about 4 degrees. So it's quite a substantial impact. This is also consistent with results we find from climate model simulations. This is based on simulations that we coordinated also within GWEX, so the class project. And it's looking at the impact in simulation where we prescribe soil moisture, the impact of changes in latent heat flux for temperature. And that's on mean temperature, maximum temperature, and the 95th percentile of Tmax. And you see again this linear behavior. But actually, that's interesting, and that's something we still need to investigate. The total impact seems to be a bit underestimated. So again, here we find a total effect of the order of about 4 degrees, and here about 2 degrees. So possibly, I think that's something we need to investigate in more detail. So I just want to say a few more words about those simulations. So what we did was, it was a project which was coordinated among several modeling groups, including, for instance, NCAR and also the MPI in Germany. And so what was done was simulation similar to those done in SEMIP 5, where basically we have the reference simulation, that's SEMIP 5, and then we have simulation where we prescribe soil moisture. So we have one where we prescribe soil moisture similar to present-day climatology, another one where we have a transient climatology. And so what we compared was actually the difference between this experiment A and experiment B, which is looking at just the mean impact of soil moisture drying. And you see here the impact on temperature and it's basically the impact in the context of climate change projections, so for the end of the 21st century. And it's quite substantial, so you see many regions actually it leads to a total warming. This change on some oceans leads to a total warming of 1 to 4 degrees. I was just thinking maybe you don't mind it in Saskatchewan if it gets a bit warmer, but so yeah. Okay, so I will say a few words about droughts. So I'm going to see this figure, which is just illustrating possible drivers of droughts and why it's relatively complex. So basically, when you are interested in droughts, first there are different types of droughts. So there is meteorological drought, which is related to a lack of precipitation. Then you have soil moisture drought, so it's basically lack of moisture in the soil. And then hydrological drought, so basically lack of stream flow. And there have been a lot of debate in the literature about whether there have been changes in the past or not, and whether this is due to anthropogenic climate change or not, and similar for the future. And the main reason for this is that it's a quite complex issue. So if you're interested in basically droughts or lack of soil moisture or lack of stream flow, basically you need to take into account three main processes: so potential evaporation, evapotranspiration itself, and then meteorological drought, so lack of precipitation. But generally, intuitively, you would mostly think of precipitation, but those impacts here of potential evaporation and transpiration can be quite important. And so, for instance, if you look at potential evaporation is a function of temperature, radiation, wind speed, and relative humidity. And these are in part external drivers, but they are in fact also affected by feedbacks from the land surface. So if you have, for instance, more evaporation, you will have then increased relative humidity. And also wind speed is actually changing as a function of climate change. Radiation possibly also, for instance, if you have changed, first in long wave due to change in greenhouse gases, but also there has been change in aerosol concentrations. And so all of those feedbacks are quite complex. Precipitation itself is, of course, an external driver, but it can be also affected by land-atmosphere feedback. In addition, there are internal feedback here between soil moisture drought and evapotranspiration. So it's just to illustrate the type of issues we are dealing with. In addition to this, we have quite uncertainties about the exact way to either represent those processes or to observe them. So this is a study that's not from our group, that was from Justin Sheffield and colleagues. It was published in Nature and was looking at the impact of the formulation of potential evapotranspiration for changes in global droughts over land. And they were using two different formulations for potential evaporation. Is a Sohn's weight, a potential evaporation on Penman-Montis. And Penman-Montis is a more complex representation, which includes those various drivers, while Sohn's weight only includes a relationship to temperature. And what you see is if you take the more simple approach, you have the impression that you get general drying. But actually, if you take the more complex approach that takes into account all the actually relevant drivers, you see almost no drying here in this measure of drought. And also the total area in drought does not change that much. So that's one source of uncertainty, is potential evaporation. Another source of uncertainty is precipitation. And actually there, it's not so much about how precipitation affects droughts, but rather what has been the precipitation. And that's a study from Kevin Trenberth showing that depending on which data set you use for precipitation, you get very different trends in droughts. So actually, even though you have the impression maybe that precipitation is a variable that should be well known, there are large uncertainties about how recent trends have looked like. And so basically, you could also get different trends from this. Now, a third uncertainty is evapotranspiration itself. So you have potential evaporation, but then the final question is, how do evapotranspiration itself look like? And we have done some study within our group and in collaboration with colleagues within GWEX to look at the total uncertainty in evapotranspiration data sets. And you see that this uncertainty, so all of those data sets in red, green, and yellow are observational based estimates, so which use some observation and some algorithm. And you see that there are very large variations between those different data sets. And the total uncertainties are quite a range here, can be of the order of up to about 30%, so it's huge. So in a recent study that was published this year in Nature Science, we did an assessment of global trends in wetting and drying over land. And the main point that we were addressing was this uncertainty in datasets. So what we did was to put all of those datasets that are available for precipitation, potential evaporation, and actual evapotranspiration, and derive from these robust trends using a framework here which is based on Bodico. So it's a traditional framework in hydrology. And it's basically relating the fraction of precipitation that's used for evaporation as a function of this aridity index, which is looking at the ratio between potential evaporation and precipitation. And in addition, we have here an additional parameter, the omega here, which is a function of the vegetation cover, which gives you the curvature here. Then we use this framework, so the little dots you see in blue here is all the different combination you get from the available observation data sets that we have in all the different locations. And you see that they are all over the place, and actually some of them, for instance, also, so the absolute bound of this relationship would be those two lines, and in some cases they are even outside the bound. So what we did in the study, Peter Greve, a PhD student, did was to look at total uncertainty from those given data sets as a departure from the expected curve. And then from this derives the most robust data set. And the result is here. So what you're seeing here is the root mean square weighted error for all the range of data sets that he considered, basically for evaporation, precipitation, and potential evaporation. And what is interesting, so this root mean square weighted error is compared to the Bodico curve. And I don't know if you have the number of data sets. Yeah, so the data set include 4 precipitation data sets, 11 potential evaporation data sets, and 7 evaporation data sets. And interestingly, so as mentioned, there were a lot of studies about the possible role of uncertainty in potential evaporation. It does have an impact, but it's not that large. There was also some studies on the uncertainty in precipitation. We see certainly that it does affect root mean square weighted errors. But actually, we found that the main source of uncertainty is the different evapotranspiration data set that could be considered. And so you see that there are really wide range here of possible values. And so from this, what we did was to only focus on those data sets that lead to least errors compared to the Bodico curve. And this leads us then to look at possible trends in moisture availabilities and based on those most robust combinations. And that's the result, where we were looking at change in droughts over land and looking at basically 2 time frames. First, a 20-year period from 48 to 68, and then 85 to 2005, and looking at which region are showing a drying trend and which region are showing a wetting trend. So actually, there is not much of a signal in Canada, so that's more or less fine. But we find, and in general, I would say that's a general result. In many regions of the world, we don't find much of a change, actually. But there are some regions that either showed a wetting or a drying. So drying is shown with the red color, and wetting is shown with blue colors. And so this is expressed as a function of either regions which showing an increase of evapotranspiration compared to precipitation or change in potential evaporation to precipitation. So these were basically the regions where we find robust changes. And one reason we wanted to do this study was to investigate a relatively well-established paradigm within the climate research, which you often heard, which is dry gets drier, wet gets wetter, so dry region gets wetter, drier, and wet region gets wetter. And we wanted to investigate whether this paradigm is well-established and supported by this data. What we did here was to consider dry and wet regions based on hydrology, so again, using the aridity index from Bodico. And so this is the map here. So basically, you have wet regions is where potential evaporation over precipitation is smaller than 2. So, and then dry regions, this factor is larger than 2. And then you have transitional regions. And I hope this would fit with what you would expect also in this region. And then so we looked at which cases we had dry regions which were getting drier in red, wet region getting wetter, so both of those basically fitting this paradigm. and then regions which don't fit the paradigm. So is a dry region getting drier, wet regions getting drier, or transitional regions showing some changes. And you see that actually it's only in the minority of the regions that we find that dry regions, it did get drier and wet regions get wetter. That's basically here in North America, in the eastern part of North America, and some part, for instance, here of South Africa. But actually the main results, it's those regions that show that this paradigm is invalid. It includes many regions which are actually relatively humid, tropical regions, which have become drier in the recent past. So you see, for instance, here, tropical Africa. And so this doesn't fit in this paradigm. So there's no clear support for the dry gets drier and wet gets wetter paradigm. And the reason this paradigm has been put up is mostly based on ocean trends. So if you look at ocean data, regions where basically you have mostly, which are mostly a source of moisture, so where evaporation is larger than precipitation on ocean surfaces, tend to show an even increased gradient in recent years. But this has not a direct link with what is happening on the land. So that's one more example where basically ocean data was used to infer something about what is happening in general over land, and it's actually not correct. And I'm not sure, maybe for those familiar with the study of Held and Southern, that was actually a very well-established study in climate science, which were looking at those trends in precipitation minus evapotranspiration. And so this paper, for those familiar with the paper, you will recognize this curve, which is basically showing the change in precipitation minus evaporation as a function of latitude. And so that was actually the main source for this paradigm, that you see that change in precipitation minus evaporation, if you average it globally, will show basically a positive change in tropical regions and also in high latitude, and then actually a decrease in mid-latitude and some mid-latitude regions, subtropical regions, excuse me. But most of the signal here in the black curve is due to the ocean signal again. So if you look at the black curve and then the blue curve, they're almost the same. So this general feature, which was brought up as a kind of main paradigm for changes in moisture availability, applies to ocean. Now, if you look at what you have over land, you see that the land curve here in green is very different. So you cannot infer what is happening on the land from what you see in the ocean. And that's why basically we don't find really a clear relationship between what is found in the land compared to what is inferred from the global behavior. Okay, so now I come to the forcing of land albedo on temperature extremes and droughts. No, I'm doing fine. And yeah, actually here I'm coming partly in back to one question I had from one student this morning. I don't remember whom it was, but it was actually a question about changes in drainage and whether this affects the climate system. And I think there is sometimes some questioning about this, because most people, maybe a farmer would think mostly of his own land and saying, well, if I do some change in management, why would this have an impact on the climate system? Of course, a single farm will not have a major impact, but if all of the farming within a huge amount of land is going to be modified, this could have some quite strong impact on the climate system. And so one investigation we did here was to look at impact of no-till farming. So this is actually a type of farming that is quite well established in North America, especially in the US. I'm not sure about Canada, maybe also in Canada. But in Europe, actually, it's not quite common. And so the idea is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with no-till farming. Most of them, so you are all familiar with it. So it's really much less of a topic in Europe. So the idea is basically you don't till the soil. And so from this, basically, you have residues of the crops on the soil. And so having those residues basically modifies the albedo, so change the reflectivity of the surface. And we had some measurements here from the southern France, where we looked at different albedo, so basically after conventional tillage, and then 1 year which include no tillage. And you see that there are major impact on the albedo. So basically, when you have those residues on the soil, it increases very much the reflectivity, so it increases the albedo. And so the study, which was here led by Edward Davan, was to look at the possible impact of this change in albedo in regional climate simulations over Europe. We're just interested to see what would happen if we modify the albedo in this way. And we find some quite interesting results in terms of impact on extremes. So these are the results so we had simulation for all of Europe, where albedo was changed by 0.1. And this is the impact for 2 regions in Europe, so Southern Europe and Northern Europe. And this is the total impact for the world distribution of temperature. So if you think of the total distribution, Q50 is the median value, so it's impact on the median value. And Q1 is impact for the first percentile, and Q99 is change for the 99th percentile. And the interesting feature was that the impact on temperature was not the same for all of the distribution. So basically, it was strongest. There was the strongest cooling here for the hottest temperature. You see that for the hottest temperatures here, you had about a cooling of almost 2 degrees. And actually, for the coolest temperatures, there was even an increase of the temperature. And it was a similar feature both in Southern Europe and Northern Europe. This was the impact of albedo alone. Then we did some additional simulation where we also looked at the impact on moisture availability. So I said, and that's another effect, but that would be another effect basically of this change in tillage. If you have those residues in the soil, it actually decreases the evaporation. And so the impact in the short term is that you have less evaporation and actually leads to a further warming actually at the surface. But if you look at the hottest temperature, we also find here an asymmetric effect, so a slight cooling. And the reason for this was when you had very hot conditions, if you had more saving of moisture in the preceding months to years, this means that you had a bit more moisture available and then you had a cooling from that. And so if you combine the 2 effects together, you get a very strong asymmetric impact on the temperature distributions. So you see that there is a very strong cooling of the hottest temperature, both in Northern Europe and Southern Europe, again of the order of 2 degrees. And for instance, for the median temperature, only 1 degree cooling, and then a slight warming for the coldest temperatures. And so I think this is an interesting result, first because it suggests maybe that it's really important to look at the impact of management, for instance, for agricultural management, but also that it's interesting to look at extremes compared to change in mean. So looking at mean changes does not tell you what happens with extremes. You really need to look at the whole distribution. And so in addition to that, this effects of management, so we spoke about water management, but also agricultural management is not considered in current climate models. And of course, another aspect would be that this could be possibly relevant for climate engineering, because if you could get really a cooling of the hottest temperatures by 2 degrees, this is not negligible. More recently, that's another study led by Mika Willem, a PhD student in our group, did now global scale simulation, also changing albedo on the global scale, now for all of the vegetated areas, so in the context of geoengineering aspects. And we looked at the total impact now of different possible changes in surface albedo over vegetated areas, so both crops and forest. And we also found a quite substantial impact on temperature. Another interesting aspect was that, so maybe you can just focus on the red versus the blue results. So there are also 2 curves for basically the mean maximum temperature, the highest temperature. So you see again a stronger cooling for the highest temperature. But another interesting point was that there was a stronger cooling in the future climate change scenario compared to the present day. And so there are different reasons for this. And part of I actually didn't explain this, but part of the reason for this asymmetric effect is that during the hottest day, you basically have less cloud cover. So you have actually more radiation, which means that the change in reflectivity is more efficient at cooling the surface. And this effect is even increased in the context of climate change scenarios. So again, in the future, then we have even less cloud cover. And in addition to this, and I'll discuss this later, there is also feedback with some moisture. And both of this effect means that we have even a further increase of this effect under climate change scenario. The other effect that is relevant, that's where I was mentioning that possible impact of albedo also on hydrology, is we found actually from this change in albedo also a decrease drying in the simulations. So that's the reference simulation. You see this quite substantial drying in the future, for instance, in North America. In Southern Europe, this is a concern because these are including many agricultural regions. And in the simulation with higher albedo, we actually have much less of a drying. And the reason for this was basically you have less warming, and then through feedbacks, you have over several years and less drying by the end of the century. And so we basically found these two feedback loops. On the one hand, you have an impact of albedo on temperature directly here, but then you have an additional delayed effect through some moisture feedbacks. And I just want to mention that we have a project that was recently funded, which I've also mentioned, so funded by ERC, and where we are going to focus at impacts basically on droughts and heat waves. First, looking at processes based on observations, then constraining them in Earth system models, and then looking at applications, both in terms of extreme attribution and possible land geoengineering. And we have several collaborators who are also going to contribute. So I come to the conclusions. I think the main point I want to make is, of course, land hydrology is interesting by itself, but there's also several important impacts on the atmosphere. So it can play an important role for a number of climate extremes, temperature, and also drought, so not only in terms of land hydrology itself, but also in terms of those feedbacks with the atmosphere. It induces some nonlinear effects, which impact extremes differently from the mean climate, so that's another important aspect. If you're interested in extremes, you really need to look at extremes itself. You cannot infer those changes only from the change in mean climate. And this is relevant for weather forecasting, for trend attribution, climate projection, and also adaptation, possibly also land climate engineering, at least on regional scale. And so basically, I would really advocate the consideration of land hydrology as a fully coupled element of the climate system, because it's an essential aspect to develop. Thank you very much.
Time for questions. And Graham mentions we have prizes, actually, on this last day for students who are asking questions. I think these are Sen's aluminum water bottles, so I'll see the hands spring up. There's one. Great. First question.
Very interesting presentation. Yes. You mentioned clouds at the very end there, and there hadn't been really a discussion about the uncertainties associated with cloud cover and how that can change a lot of these models. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that for the uncertainties associated with those in the climate change models.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And so it's true that changes in clouds as relative uncertain is also model dependent. And so this study that we did was done with one model. It's an NCAR model. And that's actually one caveat that we included, that we say we don't know how it would look like with a different model. But we looked at the behavior of the model, and it's basically, it's not an outlier, at least. So it looks like it's behaving more or less normally compared to other models. But I mean, it's true that it's one feedback loop which is not very well constrained. Yeah.
Yes?
I have a question about, you had a graph in the no-tillage.
Yeah.
And after, I think, the one that had days on it.
Yeah.
And it dropped at 40 days?
Yeah.
Can you tell me why? Or?
Yeah, so the main reason was actually that there was some rain.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there was a precipitation event. So once basically the soil was wet, there was much less of a difference between the two.
Okay, thank you.
Questions? Yes? Man, we got to bring water bottles every day. Students are leaping. Questions?
I had a question about the soil moisture dynamics and how you have hot days that follow in the summer and how you can tease apart cause and effect. Couldn't it just be that it was going to be a dry area for that year, so that when you have lower soil moisture, you have a hotter summer? Like, is the land really causing this heat? That comes
no, it's a good point. And I mean, we cannot, so in the observational study, we cannot exclude that this is a confounding effect. So that basically you would have, for instance, some persistence in the ocean, which would lead to hot temperature, to dry condition in the spring and then hot condition in the summer. We can tease out, so I didn't include those results here, but But I mean, you can tease out this, of course, in a modeling setup. And so I didn't have really time to go into this, but there were several studies showing with models that basically you can really explain, well, you can only simulate those hot extremes when you include some moisture decline in the spring. Now, of course, that's a model feature, and that's a question, how can you validate this? So the first step that we did was to use those proxy as precipitation deficits. But yeah, I mean, that's a problem when you do only statistical analysis, that you always have some possible confounding effects, yeah. I would say the understanding of this process of the argumentation would come from the modeling studies, which shows that in a model, basically, you need to have some moisture feedbacks, yeah.
Okay, non-student questions. Oh. Yeah.
I think it's a very simple question. So you talked about soil moisture temperature feedback.
Yeah.
I know that has strong influence on the evapotranspiration estimation, and I would like to ask you, how strong is the effect on the stream flow or runoff estimation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not really something we have looked at. Maybe that would be something, a question for your institute. I mean, I would expect that there is a substantial effect, because I was showing this figure about droughts. Where is it? No, it's later on. Well, anyways, the soil moisture drought itself is affecting stream. Well, I don't know. Actually, I'm doubting this now after my discussion with Jeff this morning, because he said possibly the two processes are almost disconnected. But I guess it's an open question, but you would expect at least some impact of soil moisture availability on stream flow. So now, if soil moisture and temperature are connected, then you would expect that this feedback is also relevant to some extent for runoff. But the question is here, how strong is the link between soil moisture storage and stream flow? And if stream flow is just reacting very quickly to precipitation, then it could be less relevant. That's, I guess, an open question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments? Okay, I think we're just coming on 5 o'clock. We're going to make a transition to Alexander's. So for those who would like to join, Sonia will be there along with several from the group.
Yeah.
And Sonia, thanks very much for a really stimulating talk and
thank you very much.
Great insights into this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Prizes at the front.